Hello everyone, today we talk about the Parthian army organization. We already made some video about Parthian warfare here and there, however, admittedly we haven't ever framed it from a general perspective. There will be many videos before we achieve that completely. Starting from the army organization can be, of course, a good mean to understand this people better. This is actually a complex topic, as what we think of the Parthians like is, of course, all framed within a dynamic of steppe invasion, settlement in certain parts of the Middle East, and then further expansion, mobilizing also peoples in between that we call Parthians, and that, of course, participated to the Parthian armies with their manpower, but that in fact weren't quite Parthians per se. And Parthian warfare is not only, as we will see today, just the typically sort of anti-Roman or anti-Seleucid at the beginning period. We find the Parthians, essentially their ancestors, participating even to Xerxes' invasion of Greece back in the day. And of course there is a rich military historical culture regarding the broader ethnic group from which they stemmed, that were essentially the Scythians, as we will see now. Unfortunately, the history of those peoples and regions, also in the moment in which in fact they settled in Persia, it's not well documented. This is a bit the same thing that had happened with the Medes, with the Achaemenids, and more. So we will, if anything, deal with it in another video. What naturally is interesting for today is understanding what kind of development the Parthian armies went through on the basis of the army organization. That did vary over time, because we have the idea of cataphract and lots of horse archers, and that's essentially Parthia. But especially in the early day, especially as far as the Parthians really started becoming a considerable power against the Seleucids, it wasn't quite only like that. There is also an interesting connection that will not grow today with the Sasanian army. That, as you know, basically is just, we're talking the Arsacids for the Parthian period, then the Sasanians. This was essentially the same people that were reigning on, just different dynasties that changed over time. There were, yes, different and further re-injections of steppes elements. That's quite the case from the northeastern frontier, from which in fact the same Parthians originated in the area. And of course also some essentials that remain as far as the essentially heavily Persified military culture, plus with this steppe element also in the later times, but that are in fact quite different militaries in times in history. And we will see, I made, I think, very early in Schwerpunkt's days that a bit about, I think it was about the Persian cataphracts, but I don't remember exactly. The Grivan Par, for example, like the heaviest kind. And we should actually come back on those, even though I've already made the videos, but I could make them much better after now some years of distance. In any case, if anything, this is the hallmark of Arsacid warfare. The cataphract, as we understand it in its more developed form, of heaviness, and especially of complete armoredness of both rider and horse, actually pertains to that period, not the later Sasanian one. It actually saw a split, and not just a lightening actually of the same cataphract, but for this reason some sort of greater interaction between sort of more specialized troops, also largely now on a statal basis, that these people had by now essentially been able to establish somewhat in Mesopotamia, aside from the various Roman distractions in the region. there is no doubt the Persians were always sort of the weaker side compared to the West. In the Levant, you got to appreciate, like, say, the relentless effort that this power always made to try to seize those lands, but also failing, even when exploiting favorable moments, like, for example, the Jewish revolts against Rome and other moments. Now, I will not talk about this stuff, but just know that there is an evolution in terms of cataphract warfare. We didn't talk the Parthians or the Sasanians in the Eurasian steppes warfare series, or maybe I don't remember. I should check that out. So we already addressed here and there the topic, but it will be more clarified when we will link videos like this with one of the Sasanians. Now, there is a 2nd century AD source, Justinus, that describes the Parthians in the following way. On horses they go to war, to banquets, to public and private tasks, and on them they travel, stay still, do business, and chat. This is literally the equivalent of the phrase that I always use, that these people literally spent their entire lifetime on horseback. This is not fully true, in as much as, indeed, as I was saying before, we didn't, for example, cover much this era in the Eurasian steppes warfare series because we're not talking the steppes, right? There are very steppified, let's say, military systems in the Middle East, but they're not quite like in the steppes. In fact, this is also a bit of a stereotype of a overemphasis on this particular cavalry dimension. It is, let's say, the greater difference, if anything, is the availability of a feudal system development in places like Persia that were quite sedentary and had experienced this sort of more autocratic steppe influence rule from quite early on, and that definitely allowed for this hybrid system of a state or something more feudal, like people settled in pastures at the frontier, at the margins of civilization. So the Parthians lay in between. They take over these lands as nomadic horsemen, eventually, however, dealing with the obvious hybrid dynamic that came with ruling over the locals that were sedentaries. So the Parthians can be described primarily as a Scythian people, as we were saying before. So it's an Iranian population. I made a video about the Scythians. In general, there are a quite broad. There is some ambiguity when you want to sort of divide, for example, the Sarmatians from the Scythians, because these were different waves. At the end of the day, always the same Indo-European conquerors. That at some point it's also with the Alani, were there yet another people, were they actually just a Sarmatian tribe? This classification is not even so crucial, telling the truth. Let's say that from 700 BC, the Scythians proper occupied the area north of the Danube and east of the Carpathians in the westernmost area. And so most of their power laid actually in the east, where they had also directionally come from. So across the grasslands of East Central Europe and the Pontic region to the Don. And beyond the Don, and stretching to the Chinese hinterland, were other mounted Iranian nomads that would come at different waves or would settle in different places with different degree of success. We're talking again the Sarmatians, the Massagetai, the Saka. At this point, the steppes were practically overly dominated by the Indo-Europeans. Like the Proto-Turco-Mongols were reduced just in a very narrow and fringe area of the northeastern part of the steppe. Of course, the more prospered part was in the west. This is for stressing how, of course, the warfare of these peoples, if anything, because the steppes is relatively homogeneous, was pretty much the same. There were developments in their mostly arms and armor, cavalry tactics. The Macedonian arrival in the Seer Dryad, the defeats that the Scythians had suffered at the hands of the Megas, brought, for example, to the development of the cataphract as such. That's not just a simply, say, a spontaneously native aspect of Iranian warfare. It's just something that they created to respond to the heavy infantries of the West at that point, because the Achaemenids were just talking about it the other day. Were not. They had good infantry, as a matter of fact. Also, much more collectively trained than the Greek ones, at least until the Macedons took over. But they were essentially attributing much greater importance to cavalry already, say, in Achaemenid times. The highly developed technology to evolve to cope with such difficult environment like the steppes was so ingrained among these peoples, together with their political and social balance, that there was no way they could fight essentially in another way. So the Scythians were a northern Caucasian people. They were even very similar to the Celts. For example, great part of also Celtic metallurgy in, say, Proto-Celtic times, also in times in which the Indo-European branches were not that neatly separated, seems to have actually come from the Scythian world. The same, there are wide debates on this. We see, for example, admittedly, yes, the first evidence of some Celtic chainmail, for example, far in the east, right, in very close to the Scythian lands, except they're seemingly an Etruscan chainmail piece that actually predates that. So that's not so important, because at the end of the day, all these Iranian steppes peoples had been swarming to Europe for such a long time. So actually, we as Indo-Europeans are a product of that. Together with all the, think about chariot warfare spreading far and wide, right, up to Ireland, from the bowels of Central Asia. The Scythians didn't even make much use of chariotry for that matter, because by this point, these were actually the peoples who had began to develop cavalry proper, that up to this point had not been an independent arm. Right, this in part has to do with the lack of surplus for maintaining the incredibly expensive, in fact, chariots that just the massive Mesopotamian and Egyptian states could afford. States that were being ravaged by the Scythians, by the way, during the previous centuries. So when you look at the kurgans, so these great burial mounds of the royal Scyths that were essentially like the stronger tribe of the people, and so containing the actual body types of this man, like so pure Scythians, you can argue, they actually look extraordinarily Nordic, and so that's properly there is also a great debate there, where, for example, probably that culture of chivalry stem from. I made a video that explains how the very first possible evidence of stirrups, for example, may come from the Pontic steppe, not much from Central Asia per se. That's actually debatable, and probably also not that crucial, because eventually it sort of spread mostly from the east, but still from these Indo-European riders. It gives you an idea of how truly militaristic this culture was. We find realistic gold repoussé works, such as the pieces at the Kul Oba vase, that shows really their somatic traits in a very clear sort of European way, northwest, northeast, also European in nature. The Parthians stemmed essentially from this people. Right, they are Iranians that, as a maniple, like figuratively meant, of Scythians, manages to take over, right? Other populations in the south, in the Middle East. So there would be some, surely, like the steppes brought a lot of mobility. There were some admixtures with other peoples from other areas. It's not to say that we're talking about racial purity, as a matter of fact, even among the actual elite conquerors, because they did aggregate also with other people. But at large, right, again, the steppes were dominated by the Iranians, so there wasn't even this overwhelming ethnic variety. The Parthians, who are the Parthians? Well, again, this would deserve another video per se, but we could approximate by stating that they belonged to the Parni, that were in turn a branch of the Daai confederation of Scythian tribes. They lived essentially east of the Caspian Sea, which is actually a lake, as you know, and so more or less in the same areas that, for example, in which the Khwarezmians would develop, and were in fact an incredible and astonishing lot of Indo-European traditional practice was preserved, even among peoples that by that point had been sort of heavily influenced by the Turks, for example, at least properly in terms of both lifestyle and actual beliefs. This militaristic religious cults, not really much changed in the migration era. Going back to our times, the Parthians enter essentially Persia from the north, right? The northeast, if you consider especially the more civilized western part of Persia, that was also importantly urbanized and quite developed. So quite different from, say, the eastern part of the country that is notoriously instead much poorer, because it had also historically been more exposed to steppes incursions, and where in fact the Persians, and in fact basically the Parthians themselves, that installed themselves in western Iran and later in Mesopotamia, allow other steppes peoples to settle so that they can use them as subjects, right? Cultivating the more developed parts, their heavily armored cavalry, and having all these other auxiliaries coming from nowhere. It's such a millenary dynamic in the region. It's almost, like stating always the same old story. But this is also what makes it interesting, because the ways of war were also quite similar and comparable. By the way, in the 7th book of his history, Herodotus lists the contingents, weapons, and dress of the Achaemenid forces involved, as we were saying before, in the invasion of Hellas in the 5th century BC, during the reign of Xerxes. So way before, as we'll see now, the Parthians properly came about as a single polity right on their own. However, these are listed as with the Choriasmi under the command of the Achaemenid satrap Artabazus. In other words, they were people. There were lots of different steppes populations that the Achaemenids could simply recall from beyond even their formally definable boundaries. The ancestors of the Parthians, of later Parthians, were armed with a bow, short sword, and spears. No shields were carried. This is, however, also an approximation of Herodotus. We will talk about these peoples because, as you know, we have a series about all the various auxiliaries of the Achaemenid army. We can think them wearing a tall bashlik cap with long tail and earpieces, close-fitting tunic, trousers, ankle boots. So all, of course, very comfortable clothes for riding, because that's literally what they would do even more intensely at this point in history and later on. A lidded quiver is slung from the waist belt on the left side, and we find Parthian tribute bearers on the staircase bas-relief leading to the upper down of the famous palace at Persepolis in Fars, built by Darius the Great. And they are shown in thimble-shaped enclosed hats, long belted coats, long trousers, and ankle boots, so very much like other Iranian peoples, just like to distinguish, to say, okay, this is yet another one that we can distinguish as Achaemenids being under our control. So you can extend the Parthian family to the Sakas, right? You know, that's also another term that was used to define this populations of north of Persia out there in the steppes. The Dahai, which the Parni, so the ancestors of the Parthians, came from, were part of them. So the history that we're mostly concerned with today is when the Parni occupied the Seleucid satrapy of Parthia in the mid-3rd century BC. In the meanwhile, the Achaemenid Empire had been taken over by Alexander. Then the Diadochi had split the empire. The Seleucids had affirmed themselves as basically the major power, continuing in many ways, especially the Asian legacy of Alexander, and extending, in fact, as far as this northeastern frontiers with the steppes. That, as you know, they are also a bit shaded. There's not quite a radically neatly outlined border, right? There are lots also of cemeteries leading de facto in the steppes, climatologically defined, and these are very important places because some of the most important caravans of transcontinental trade cross them, and in fact they allow for some surplus of colonies, many of which or cities that pre-exist towns, we could say, that pre-existed Alexander, that however were refounded at that point, and that technically in theory the Seleucids ruled on, but at some point there had been secessions. Think about the Bactrians. There is a lot of, for example, pre-Alexandrine Hellenic colonists that had been settled out by the Achaemenids, apparently from Crete, and that didn't like Alexander because they were too, say, democratic, or say better, that Alexander was rather too monarchic for their tastes, and they preferred to live in this as military colonists to a degree, as in this military frontier there, and so there is a disgregating order in this northeast. It's very difficult to reach them, as you know, at the end of the 3rd century itself. The beginning of the second, the Seleucids have carried out a veritable anabasis, so literally an expedition toward this, by the way, geographically massive hinterland, where apparently the Seleucids got also their own cataphracts from, because they started appearing after that expedition in the army of Antiochus III, the great Antiochus, before also Rome came to put an end, at least to the empire as a large power, reducing it to something smaller, which also in fact had been preluded by this further issues on the northeastern frontier when the Parni descended to Parthia and began to settle in there, establishing in fact just south of the Caspian Sea. They occupy places like Hyrcania. The Parthia proper is basically in the southeast of the Caspian Sea, and of course they posed themselves in an adversarial relation with the Seleucids, but at the same time they settled there as subjects of the same, because this Diadochi power was so great and vast and sort of universal in the region. Of course, the Parni couldn't do much to take it down. However, this also allows for this now newly founded, in fact, Parthian kingdom to, first of all, to establish itself and to gradually expand by capitalizing upon the crisis of the Seleucid Empire, in fact, managing to overrun most of the same eastern provinces. There wasn't much of a continuity with the Macedonian rule, in fact, the same Parthian invasions, let's say we can so call them, correspond to this disgregation of a, of a, say, Macedonian statehood that in those fringe areas had been quite feeble historically, but not scarcely important. In fact, there is a lot of, as we'll see now, also Hellenistic influence in the Parthian armies. And there is bring essentially to the imposition of the Parthian overlordship on local princes in Persis, Elymais, and Media Atropatene. These regions are basically literally Persia and then shifting towards Mesopotamia and the Caucasus, respectively. And the power acquired by these people is enormous because fundamentally, in spite of the fact that the Romans would crush it repeatedly at some point, which is hardly what the Persians could ever do, thanks to, the Mesopotamian state especially, so the sea of a millenary civilization, of actual massive cities and states and so on, would allow for some greater, more stable development. It also made it a much easier target, and that's why the Romans conquer and crush the capital Ctesiphon, by the way. But every time this was occurring, still Persia was a thing on its own. It's practically impossible to conquer Persia, at least to, if not to stay there, and to end up absorbed by the same Persian world, which happens to all the invaders, because it's a nightmarish enterprise. It's not that Persia per se is particularly developed, say, this time in history, as we've seen the West actually was, but also comparatively to what laid West, well, it was scarce, and that's basically the best they had. So in spite of this, that combination, as we said, between statehood and sort of tribalism allows for that feudal hybrid that the Parthians also developed as their own establishment, that manages to remain flexible, right? When the major defeats are inflicted, central power pulverizes, but the various princes basically elect at some point other leaders. There is another dynasty affirming, and this sort of can come back because in the first place, when you ravage Mesopotamia, still for the Romans it's still too far. At some point they have to abandon it, even when they conquered under Trajan. And so all this destabilization allows for those steppes war bands of nomadic warriors to come and loot and do, and swell the ranks of the either the Arsacid or especially the Sasanian army. At least if you consider the coming back of the latter, it was also much more enhanced compared to one of the Parthian times. In fact, the Parthians, as you know, were notoriously mocked in the ancient world, surely in a stereotypical sense, but it does make some sense, regarding their lack of polyurcetic capacity, meaning that they, as a steppe people, were not habituated to siege warfare, a big deal. And so apparently the major step that was done in providing Persia with major siegecraft capacity after the Parthians are taken over are Roman turncoats passing over to the Persian army, and in Sasanian times allowing for some better siege capacity. In fact, in capacity to threaten the cities of Levant, that wasn't really the ultimate reason why they were capable to do so, but just because things were also going worse for the Romans on the latter's account. So yeah, as you understand, it's actually a pretty dense military history. We've seen it also in some detail, for example, in the video about Antony's Parthian expedition at Senilia. There is Carrhae, there's more, but once you get the essentials, it becomes easier to understand. So before addressing some aspects of the thing, not much the Parthian army organization, because we do not know even too much about this, really. It's something importantly different from, say, the Sasanian one that, again, happened in later times in a more a civilized context, so to say, especially for the Persians. And there were so many different changes, probably in the nature of warfare, that a lot of, as we've seen, Roman influence, and previously also the Hellenistic one we partly see today among the Arsacids. In any case, again, it's crucial to understand the political and social essentials of this population in order to understand what their army was about, because in many ways, as you know, in a feudal culture, basically the establishment is militarized, right? And so you can speak of a feudal system of the Parthians that in turn, in fact, was derived from the Scythian one. You do need lots of land in order to maintain a horse. Even in the steppes, there are subjects even in the steppes, especially if we're talking, in fact, the lighter horse archers, those are basically like of a lesser condition compared to the aristocrats that mount much heavier horses, that have much tougher and expensive panoply. There is also, of course, a pinch of Achaemenid as well as Seleucid background to the Parthian army, right? So overall, the Parthian warfare was not so extremely different from even what you can see, say, with different variables, of course, in, say, early medieval Europe, as with the rise. Of course, these were much more equestrian cultures, especially consider the amount of horses and sort of the closer, in fact, much closer sources of excellent mounts. This greater affinity with the steppes was cultural in the measure in which the Parthians, as you know, prospered as they were in between great civilization, namely Rome and China, and being a great pain in the behind, considering that they in fact blocked the continental route for between the two empires, that even included horses, right? Augustus, among the first things that he does when he goes to Egypt is actually looking at the quite prized Nicaean horses that the Ptolemies had partially cultivated for their shock, like Macedonian-style cavalry. It was a feudal one. Talk about the Ptolemaic army organization, we could add more, but in case those horses did come from Central Asia and had passed through, in a way or another, through the Parthian lands, unless they had imported them from India, from the Red Sea, through the Red Sea, I mean, and but this is not so important as much as the fact that much of the actual Parthian and Persian power historically derives from that specific location in between many other powers, and controlling important transcontinental routes in areas that are also quite otherwise devoid of strong powers. Persia being definitely the only one in a pretty large area all around. Parthian society was headed by 7 powerful clans historically. This upper stratum supported a petty aristocracy of varied status that, together with their retainers, enjoyed, in fact, a much higher condition than, of course, the peasants, the serfs, who were, in this sense, native subjects to Persia. Remember also the ethnic, the racial divide. These steppe peoples, the Indo-Europeans, were pretty white, and so there was a great deal of reference to this also in their mythology and more. And so there were all a real system of castes. If anything, we'll talk about this in some history of religion video. As you understand, this establishment still retains some sort of confederal bias that is typical of steppe peoples. We've seen it even, for example, in the medieval kingdom of Hungary, from the Magyar background. The oligarchs were more powerful. Public authority was scarcer. That's why, as we were saying before, there wasn't really much of a center that you could destroy without having others other chunks, let's say, of this power sort of re-emerging, different houses, clans, as it happened with the Sasanians after the Assassins, for example. Loyalty was the strongest between the great clan leaders and their small vassals. I made a video about the Germanic Gefolgschaft that explains this in the ancestrally archetypal meaning of war bands. Of course, we didn't talk about the Persians there, but say the Indo-European background was pretty much the same. So that can do as well. The king was a member of one of the clans and could usually command complete loyalty from his own clan and its vassals, less from other Parthians. However, the principle laying under his primacy was exactly this typically emergential need of having a war leader that in time of peace would essentially restore it, the natural order, the balance of, say, free nobility without further interference. Naturally, every polity has a degree of coercion, and so of course also the Arsacids, if anything, for rising as a dynasty, in spite of, as we'll see, of the more typically elective system that still was in place. It's a bit like saying, I don't know, the town of the Capetians. Technically, they had to be elected in the early days, formally, but they were also already a dynasty and a monarchy on their own. They had the assets, the control on the means on the both manpower and labor force to an extent that allowed for this greater power to organize and direct itself more orderly and rational. However, this is the point, the crown, because our Sassanid times are long, and so there is an earlier history, is also not particularly clear. We do not have, for example, a clear picture of all the exact kings. Some information is blurred. In any case, we do know that this crown, in fact, did not pass from father to son as a right. It could happen, but the cornerstone of leadership was based on the worthiness to lead. So there is a lot of from Iranian tradition regarding this sense of utmost delicacy of the balance of power, that even a lie could essentially make your imperium fly away as a ruler, make you fall, which is also pretty appropriate considering the actual political practice of these people with massive instability overall among all these clans. And so the latter were expressed by an aristocratic council of leaders, of warlords that would support this or that ruler. The monarchy was new as a concept, though. The lords altogether, with their clienteles, of course, were the backbone of the army. Of course, the same king had his household troops and a retinue that would greatly attract, also, again, in very autonomous ways, also war bands from God knows where. So there was a lot of competition between these clans, keeping, in a sense, the quality of the army together to an extent. However, the downside, of course, was the perennial instability of the system. Even using the term civil to define the wars that afflicted the Parthian kingdom is a bit, say, an overestimation in civilizational terms. However, this that also prompted some further attempt to concentrate power to avoid, for example, foreign interference, because Rome was very strong and sometimes did intervene by making Parthian kings. The same nomadic peoples all around had an influence, as we understood, in the internal mechanisms. Nevertheless, the Parthians as a warrior people remained, of course, in charge of their own destiny. As you understand, they did not have, throughout this time... By the way, let's draw a chronological line here, because these are the early Parthians. So I would say, let's talk from the 3rd to the 2nd century BC, roughly. Even the 4th, depends. It's not much about the origin, it's about where do we draw the line, because This initial realm was, of course, much more primitive than what we see later. But also throughout our Sassanid times, things did not overdevelop, let's say, in military terms. There was no such thing, for example, like a regular army as a consequence. But it was not needed, right? It's like, realizing that armies can hurt a lot, even if they're not regulars. If there was no real state in a civilizationally concentrated sense, this meant that they were, say, by far, of course, weaker than the Romans, just like the fact that they fought on the eastern frontier, where things were decentralized for both contendants, of course, leveled a bit the odds, but still within the confines of that. In any case, we understood it. The Parthians had excellent cavalry. That's what definitely a strong point, quite famously was. Cataphracts, horse archers. In time of war, the nobility not only provided but simply fought by participating in the campaigns with their heavily armored knights. It's fair to call them like this, mounted on weight-carrying chargers, right? The Persian horses, at least these ones from the broader ancestry of the Nicaean, like the Fergana Valley stock, were described by classical sources notoriously as elephants. Of course, they weren't quite as big, but in fact it wasn't even about the actual size that was larger than others, but it's how beefy and compact and muscular that they really were. The mass of lesser noblemen and their retainers were instead horse archers. There were lots of them. They didn't need much order, if not just by general direction of who they had to attack and wear out before, in fact, the knights would enter the fray, hopefully crushing the enemy. Remember that this military system developed in the essentials. Yes, we said before that cataphracts were, for example, a response to the senator war toughness, but of course we were also saying that the essentials of nomadic warfare remained the same. And because this was, of course, an army that fought primarily against its own people, like all peoples develop their armies like, right? They are arming themselves not much for facing a particular foreign alien, but for fighting essentially their kin, that of course, especially in the ancient world, were sort of tendentially much more easily homogeneous in interest of geographical expansion. So the sense is that we know how some battles went. I mean, Carrhae is very famous, even though the Romans there had basically busted wings, given that their cavalry had been knocked out before. They just were pinned down, and with their heavy infantry they couldn't go much around, even if the Parthians had actually a few cavalry there, but it was enough. So that's not quite the most fitting example. If anything, in the video about Antony's expedition against the Parthians, which was a fiasco, but it was also for the Parthians, at least in the sense they didn't manage to crush the Roman army that came back in a pretty sorry state home, but still having, in fact, showing that the Parthians didn't have the sufficient kick, let's say, to finally destroy them, even when they were invading in their homeland, really shows what this entire system, what the actual weakness and limitation of such armies were. We talked about this very often also, for example, in Crusader warfare, where things had not really changed that much from among these eastern population. And the heavier Westerners were, after all, really upper-edged, so to say, and what, if anything, they would lose was much like the reason to be there, if anything, and or in fact seeing this more like a fringe theater, unlike the opponents that would have that were much more motivated and still sort of didn't, if not with great difficulty, at least during the Crusades, manage to oust the same Westerners. Well, with the Romans, in the end, instead, it took the Arabs to do so. Now, there was say, talking about the Western military culture, as you know, of these horse archers, etc. Typical, warriors mounted on tough steppe ponies, armed with reflex bow, great performance, especially in terms of range. In terms of penetration, not too much. As a matter of fact, they had lots of arrows, but they weren't decisive by definition without the shock component, right? The bow per se is just, whoever uses it is a light element, cannot dislodge the heavy one to begin with. So combined arms everywhere. The sense was threatening, of course, we'll see it in the videos about Parthian tactics, but it's notorious. Like, you threaten the enemy, with this hail of arrows that brings them to mostly spread to avoid the hits. Then there is always the threat of the cataphracts around. So when this shows itself, the units recompact. There's maybe no charge. The archers come back in and shoot into the mass, and etc. And it goes on, and not necessarily, in fact, breaks through. And a very important aspect we will see now is that, however, the early Parthian armies had a pretty substantial infantry component. Mostly good quality hillmen, and so mountaineers of some sort from the Mashrek, from this area, so the Caucasus of the Persian plateau, and also just peasant levies from the more civilized areas that weren't so reliable. At least there were ways to ambush, for example, the enemy in this pretty tortuous valleys, say in Persia and in the Caucasus, but with those mountaineers, but the peasants were just, in fact, malicious, nothing impressive. The large number of later heavier cavalry was surely a product of, in fact, some degree of statalization of the system, as it would fully be evident especially in Sasanian times. However, it is true that the Parthians, the Arsacids, let's say, better peaked the heaviness of cataphract warfare. We will see this better in a video about that historical military unit. Essentially, it's the heaviest you can find in terms of actual armoredness of warrior and cataphract, right? Among these men survived a very strong heroic ethos that in some cases brought the cataphracts to use the bow together with, so having a double function, like the softening up and so the harassing one and the shock charge one in one. This is actually not the fully typical of the Parthians, at least were not enough documented proving that this was the case. This belonged mostly to other peoples we see also a bit more towards Central Asia that remained a bit more hardcore steppe peoples. But the Parthians were much about this, and they, in fact, in early Arsacid times, they were quite much more sort of individualistic. And for this reason, not really more military effective than what they would sort of more organizationally become capable afterwards. But it's worth noticing because the heaviness of the cataphract is to be connected in that period with it. Later, the Sasanians begin to actually lighten the cataphracts. Only the frontal part of the horse is cataphracted. It's extremely heavy because also the cataphract, the rider himself is heavily cataphracted, but it's not as full as the full cataphracted horse in Parthian time. Of course, you could have in Arsacid times. However, you could have seen the same later, except it was not systematic. The most typical thing now was this split model, and also with a definitive separation of the archery component as a specialized auxiliary unit of the heavier cavalry. Again, the knights, the noblemen, were perfectly capable of using the bow from horseback, but let's say that by Sasanian times they had lost that heroism that would sort of functionally perform that double function, effectively perform the double function. But things were much more collectively and steadily organized. Also, as far as the unit types, right? This isn't the steppe tribesmen that have just arrived, like in the Parthian times. It's in fact crucial to explain how the earlier Sassanid army, and this is where we get into the details of this quality, was quite different from the stereotypical cataphract or klibanari, which is a term probably had to do with not with the oven, literally knights cooking themselves into because there would be a Latin term, by the way, but it does actually has an Iranian root. It's another story, we will see it in another video. I explained it in the video about the actual, I think I made it at the very beginning about the klibanari proper, and the horse archers. There were lots of other components, right? It's rather the 1st century BC army, the one of Carrai's times, that would consist almost entirely of light horse archers and cataphract lancers. Which again would make a lot of sense. It's not like before this time they didn't use them. But it wasn't so generalized and functionalized. Also, the local population hadn't been quite knocked out in terms of military participation and subjected to these steppe overlords to the point of being completely irrelevant, nor it would be actually completely later. But before, there were many more infantrymen, for example, in the Sassanid armies. This is actually a complicated story. We will see better also in more ad hoc videos, but there's an hypothesis that sees the actual Saka invasions of the 30s of the 2nd century BC to have spurred among this Parthian kingdom the need to have sort of much more straightforwardly functionalized heavily cataphracted lancers and horse archers, basically concentrating all resources in the mounted arm and absorbing, in fact, them from basically all the rest of the population, having virtually an entirely mounted army. The Sakas, in fact, in Central Asia were developing sort of very interesting ways of war that in part corresponds to what was going on among the Parthians themselves. That is to say, that the same Indo-European steppes were gradually sedentarizing, thus feudalizing as well. And so there were heavier types of warriors that you would have not seen before, because, say, the world ages in part, and so wealth arrives in the steppes, and this is what eventually brings to the Indo-European demise, this sort of corruption connected to a more relaxed lifestyle, when until the more primitive savages sort of break loose from the hell of the Turco-Mongolic sort of compressed, emarginated. There had been, of course, some of these steppes peoples continuously absorbed by the same Parthians in Persia, so that they would be fully aware of what the potential of these forces actually could be. They would gradually follow the developments. You can imagine this Parthian noblemen they thought like they had won the lottery, they had accomplished such a great deal by conquering Persia, etc., but still, of course, had a certain predilection towards their ancient nomadic Mars, so to say, to appreciate, for example, the military technology brought by these nomads, how they were responding, after all, to similar problems, because, for example, there were the the Indo-Scythians that had crossed, in fact, into the Indian subcontinent, which, of course, changed them quite a bit. I made some videos about these peoples, the Kuchans, the Kushans, that are actually connected, even though they're two different things. Probably the etymology is the same. And we do know, in fact, that in the eastern fringes of the Parthian Empire, that was quite wide. We call it empire because, of course, they controlled other peoples outside of this original Parni kingdom, just south of and east of the Caspian Sea. There wasn't, say, India wasn't far. Like the far easternmost satrapies of the Seleucid Empire arrived at the gates of India, and the Parthians had basically, they were really far from those cultures. I mean, they were much closer, let's say, to the Levant by the end of this period than they were to, say, places like India or even certain parts of Central Asia. Nevertheless, they do receive a lot. There is a lot of military technology that circulates around, and the Parthians did have means of rewarding these warbanders from the steppes, sedentarizing them, using them especially to counter the nobility from a monarchic standpoint, etc. However, originally, when, say, the Parni settled in the region, they would have had, of course, lots of cavalry, but they, if anything, in comparison to the local peoples, they could have not been particularly numerous, proportionally. Consider that the populations that inhabited these places, in particular from the steppes side, say, think about the Hyrcania. Those were areas, think about the Dailimes later, that were incredibly primitive as warlike and even just as infantrymen. For example, during Caliphal times, would be able still to challenge, I don't know, at that point, the Turkic Gulams, that's familiar. So the Hyrcanian hillmen were among some of the fiercest warriors of the region. And even though, again, they didn't have a state on their own, that they were somehow pretty wild, they could profitably be employed by larger powers, and the Parthians would have surely adopted them. We also know that still in 129 BC, when they were still facing the Seleucids and were yet to fully break through their power in the east, as this tells you, by the way, the Seleucids had been quite reduced in power themselves, so it's not like they were a huge power by this point, not even a regional one, it's still a provincial one. They were relatively weak in cavalry, so that, for example, when facing the Seleucid cavalry of Antiochus VII, in the prospect of a straight fight, they would actually not engage. Consider that the Seleucid kingdom, as basically most of the Diadochi ones, and particularly in this case, I would say, as a major power, they had some of the most straightforwardly as traumatically violent and violently developed equestrian forces in the entire world, right? So it's not like, even as a decadent Hellenistic power, they didn't have force. And this actually speaks volumes regarding what Alexander had actually set as a standard. Not just the Megas had conquered the Persians that had quite strong cavalry, native cavalry on their own. Say that also once settled in Persia from the steppes, but they had, peoples like, I don't know, the ones of Bessus, from the straightforward steppe, right? The European heavy cavalry would crush these guys, just as Alexander would crush the Scythians later. So, and even here we're talking just cavalry, by the way, as a cavalry engagement. So not even to say that there were the phalangites there that could, of course, impale the enemy horsemen. There is much about the actual force of Seleucid horsemen here that is clearly displayed. However, what do they do to cope with the Seleucids? They resort to that, especially numerically strong, yet also qualitatively good force of infantry, of subjects that evidently did not belong to the steppe nomadic bias of the Parthian, capable of acting in rough terrain where those wars between the Parthians and the Seleucids, in fact, in the Mashrek, were fought. So much so that they even successfully ambushed the same Seleucid cavalry with this infantry. Imagine, again, how rough the terrain can be there. And of course, if you manage to box the enemy, it's not as straightforward as there is, okay, it's just about terrain. No, that's not how it works. It's leadership, it's morale, it's lots of things. But, of course, infantry at this point is still more important than cavalry, and if you don't have enough room for maneuvering, for let's say, attacking the enemy with enough space for the charge, for deployment, these hillmen can unleash their fanatically and barbarically, say, cultivated hatred towards civilization by butchering these horses and horsemen down with their axes. And actually, they're very simple equipment that, however, in their hands was quite ferocious. Had they been met in open ground, say in Mesopotamia, they would have simply been run over by the Seleucids. But in those valleys, it's another story. There is also another aspect that is proven by very interesting iconographic evidence, namely the Zahach castle stucco, which should be, I think, the very last image that I at least of the photos, not of the pictures that I use in this video, proving how the Parthians, let's say better at this point, called upon the service of the militias of the Hellenic cities they conquered, as well as former Seleucid Katoikoi. As we explained before, since Achaemenid times, not even Alexander's, there were Greeks in Persia as military colonists. So we do not know how, well, if you look at Bactria, look at other, you do see there is a strong Hellenic evidence. Sometimes it's just, what these guys could, for example, display themselves like on coins, saying we are Greeks, so we're modeling, I don't know, Alexander's coins or the ones of the Seleucids, so it seems like everything is much more Greek than it seems. But indeed, they did go at war with a very Hellenized gear. Most of the rest of the troops wouldn't, right? Because some of those people were actual Greeks, and even not Macedonians, by the way, but even though Alexandrians, panoplies were, of course, like the Macedonian influence had been striking. But there are some, let's say, also custom adaptations of this foreign, let's say, these locals to Hellenic arms and armor. We find something very similar to a Tureos, for example, in the aforementioned Zach castle stucco. Like, this is a shield that could have been used again by a Galatian, an Oscan mercenary. And you find it in this, at the time, Parthian dominated. You see it also from the custom. This is not a Greek, right? This tells you how strong, in many ways, not just the Hellenic influence had been, but say how similar certain armament is from people to people. Consider that what we call conventionally Tureophoroi is not just like an official type of trooper from Greece, let's say, that was scientifically equipped in that way. Like, the Greeks mostly hired mercenaries as Tureophoroi, and they called Tureophoroi basically any single guy with an oval shield and some spear/javelin that is basically the universal fighter, except for Greece itself, in the entire sanitary world. and that's why literally everybody voted in the same way. The slightly lighter bias is mostly due to the fact that the Greeks got these troops from, and also especially in Hellenistic times, from the east, from places like Anatolia. In fact, these hills and mountains were this kind of good, like hillman infantry, it's a mountaineer infantry, is native of, and that fight's so poorly equipped. It's extremely cheap, but they're sort of, again, violent enough for, in fact, making the cost-benefit ratio sustainable. Also, in the absence of sort of more built-up forces, consider that, for example, Pergamon, the Attalids, even though they were full diadochoi, do not seem to have ever fielded a phalanx because they were too small, and so they stuck to some sort of hoplitic Turiophroi force, but they didn't have the assets for an actual phalanx. That is probably one of the single most expensive militaries in the history of mankind in relative terms. Instead, the Seleucids, that controlled literally the universe world, like from the Ionian Sea to the Indus at a point, they have military colonies. And so a massive cosmic asset that allows this equally cosmically expansive phalanx to be fielded. I talked about the phalanx, especially in a video about like comparison with the maniple. And it's not like it was a bad system in open field. In fact, the Romans never managed, even once, to break them frontally. If anything, they broke themselves at Pydna, apparently, if you follow Polybius, by the way. But the Seleucids have these military colonists that live in these communities called the one Catholicoi, that indeed had been present in Mesopotamia. That was initially, as you know, with the Seleucia, the first capital before Antioch in Syria, so that they came closer to where things mattered, especially in their clashes, Levantine clashes against the Ptolemies, but also in Persia and elsewhere. And so, of course, there were some forces of some kind. We'll talk about them. I actually talked about Syrians, Mesopotamians, and Persians in the Seleucid army. If you're interested in that video, to see some further clarification of the topic, that's really the best choice for you. But we will talk about them again. We know too few. But it's as if this had been former phalangites that would have not fought actually in the Parthian army as phalangites. In fact, we think that to a degree, like these communities were not even meant to simply field the phalanx anymore. Especially in the later Seleucid period, in which, again, the empire had basically already collapsed. It had been reduced to Syria or something, and so they couldn't afford that anymore. However, they were quite Hellenistic in nature. They had been quite... They are still, say, in Mesopotamia, they are Semitic peoples. In Persia, they are sort of a mix. Like you have the Iranian component in other groups. And these, at large, did maintain their own traditional military styles, except they had a bit Hellenized in arms and armor. So we see something like the one of the aforementioned Stuka. Remember that the phalanx is not used by even all the diadochoi in anything, as we said before, for the Attalids. In any case, nobody else used that, right? There is no set, just like the hoplitic phalanx of the classical era. This is an exception even among the Greeks to an extent, or the broader Hellenic world, one of the colonies, for example. So there's no copies, there is no thing like you see, I don't know, in Total War video games. They're admittedly very funny, but they allow you to do pretty strange things like having, phalanxes, even though you're not, you're not a diadochoi. In fact, the entire notion of, for example, the availability of some, let's say, for example, mercenary Sarissopheroi is historically false. This did not exist, right? The only time we hear of mercenary pikemen, Hellenistic pikemen, is at the Battle of Raphia, and we don't even know exactly if they were actually fighting with pikes, where they come from, if they were from, however, nearby colonies of these pikemen, so not roaming war bands of pikemen, because in order to have a functional phalanx you need massive numbers, which are not possessed by itinerant war bands, right? And in any case, again, you couldn't simply use them if you weren't, or just having them, like for the Parthians, it was not important to have them, right? As long as they had cavalry and they could periodically rely on this local footmen, like for specific tasks. Of course, these would have wanted something in exchange for that. It was not what evidently the Parthians were prone to give. In fact, that's what they're eventually dispensed of from military service, falling under their yoke mostly, when the Parthians really become a regional power. By the way, after the aforementioned defeat of Antiochus VII in 129, the Parthians incorporate his troops wholesale into their own service, just to say where they would get the actual forces. And again, these forces were not also only straightforwardly, as we just said, the typical, phalanx, or even just the cavalry could be made of not the sort of the finest cavalry forces that Antiochus III would have had, right? And in general, the fact that the situation is pretty messed up in the area is shown by the fact that these same Seleucid turncoats promptly deserted the Parthians to the Saka. Also because the Parthians wanted to use them against the same Seleucids, so that was not perhaps the best move to begin with. And God knows where those Seleucids ended, dispersed in the steppes, or God knows again where. And so there is all a series of Hellenistic influence. However, we should also point out that for how impacting Alexander's culture had been, still the locals were overwhelmingly sort of fighting in their own styles and traditions. There wasn't even a great deal of, say, Hellenistic mercenaries, narrowly meant, available where the early Parthians ruled, right? If anything, they could instead access those infantrymen from, again, all those rugged regions, like those used to ambush Antiochus the Seventh, that would have been thus all Asian. We know of the Tapurians, for example, that back in the day fought for the Parthians against Antiochus III, because Antiochus III's Anabasis did crush the Parthians, by the way. That at least reduced them to subjection, right? That's where they got the idea of actually settling for good where they were. So as long as the Seleucid Empire was strong, these were yet another Iranian tribe that was settled just in that fringe part of the eastern satrapies. See, the name of the province had remained even the one of the traditional to the Achaemenid world, also under Alexander, of course. This was part of this sort of cultural hybrid, which is interesting because this would prove, as we have seen from Herodotus, that as the Parthians, the Parni had been serving the Achaemenids at some point as mercenaries, as tributaries, etc. The same would have actually happened for a while among the Seleucids. So as we said before, the Parthians would never fight with a phalanx that they could at least sustain. We saw again those Seleucid turncoats, but there is no evidence they were phalangites in the sense they would actually fight with a classically, conventionally intended Macedonian phalanx. However, the Seleucids and their phalanx did fight with this kind of Asian horsemen, with Parthians. right? If you look at the Battle of Magnesia, for example, there was a great emphasis in the sources towards the sense of the, as it was habitual for these Eastern rulers, the Hellenists, in this sense, were in part, say, adopting, collecting the legacy of the same Achaemenid Empire, who used these hordes from the steppes, overly inflated numbers to an extent, but in terms of composition, you do find that there is never a full blend of these cultures, telling the truth. It's all very, again, these are mostly auxiliary forces that would provide some heavy cavalry, sometimes with not in large numbers. Mostly these horse archers, other sort of medium light cavalry, if you look at the level of heaviness of the equipment. So many Parthians would have been schooled in war also in the Seleucid army at the beginning. For the rest, the Parthians start having their own tributary subjects, their local peasant levies, so they gradually adapt to that level of civilization. That's how you get to later times. And again, unfortunately, we're not particularly well documented about the developments in between. There is a lot of scholarship on these topics, but that mostly highlights how we're taking a leap in the dark to think, to positively discern what was happening in these armies, organizationally speaking. There was no formal institution, there was no written record from the Parthian world itself to reconstruct this, and they didn't need it, because again, it was a feudal, largely private force, and so they just went at war periodically without having to ask anyone, or that they would just gathered memories of that, but we do not have them straightforwardly laid out for us, unfortunately. And so what you see later as the cataphracts or clibanari and the horse archers in this quite straightforwardly intense way of war, adapted to the sedentary war but still bringing up, say, the best of the steppes, is pretty much is happening pretty much later, right? And or if it existed before, it was in smaller proportion compared to the infantry that they could mobilize from different areas. They could always mobilize from different areas. Of course, the preference was for the horse archer. I mean, if you had to fight overall, as it happened against the Romans later, also in the moment in which they would invade the Parthian territory, you would prefer the horse archers of the steppes. They're just more combative. They're sort of way more flexible, even than the infantrymen that you can't quite sort of control with a great discipline. At least the horse archers, same, just at least can't get the hell out of the way fast when a legionary is chasing them, right? So this is essentially it. And mostly against the sedentary civilizations, the Parthians can only essentially try to wear them out, right? Subjecting them to prolonged missile attacks. With an enemy suffering from lack of food, water, or rest, we've seen how terrible, like, Antony's expedition really was. And so, essentially, taking advantage of the enemy disorder so that the success could be high. And good, fresh, well-prepared infantry in dense formation were, of course, difficult, if not impossible, to break still. On the contrary, they could prove disastrously lethal, and this is what essentially the Parthians realized against the Romans. The Romans always had the upper hand. Right? It's not cavalry that determines the average of what actual Romano-Parthian warfare was. The Romans were stronger than the Parthians. Also, tactically wise, they knew how to cope with them. It's not just to do with higher auxiliaries from those same places, but they really had stronger fundamentals. Infantry is the queen of battles. It will remain for a long time. The Romans have the finest heavy infantry. They have a lot of counter have actually much greater missile potential than the Parthians. This is often overlooked, right? When people think, oh my god, so I have horse archers that can shoot also with their composite bows at great distance, so the Romans are done for, right? They can't cope with that. What do you think that actually does? Do you think it's more powerful, like a constant shower of, of arrows from? So the timing's also pretty close. Admittedly, that did sting, and it did hurt a lot. But let's say mostly from the distance, because you didn't have to count too close to begin with, and there are still lights, right? If they can't basically count to grips with the Roman army, if anything, those would chase them once it was broken. But the Romans have heavy javelins. And so the average person will say, oh, but the javelin just has a smaller range. And so, at some point, if you want to win, you have to come at closer range. And there is no people that matches the volume of fire that the Romans have, thanks to their pila. Especially in there, it's not even, as you know, that heavy javelins were that rare. Basically, every infantry had them. Those same Parthian, those same, as we've seen, Asian infantries from the Parthian hinterland did. But they weren't as drilled, as well-equipped, as disciplined, as professional as the Romans. And so the odds were balanced. It's not like, say, the odds are balanced always because they're the product, not much of a contingential military random situation, but in fact a political action. So that's why the Romans never fully get rid of the Persians, because what do? Do you chase them into Persia for what? To conquer what? To hold what? It doesn't make any sense. You destroy this state that basically they establish every once in a while in Mesopotamia. You raze it to the ground. You burn everything. But these peoples from the Iranian plateau are going to come back. It's somehow frustrating. It's basically history of the Middle East up to today, as you see from the news. But this does not mean that the guy from the other side is actually stronger just because he survives. Actually, it's just there to get beaten repeatedly. And so this is basically the history of the region in a nutshell. Right? So this is extremely important to understand the actual fundamentals of military history and beyond. Same goes for horse archers. It's the same identical thing. They're so annoying. They're everywhere. You basically never run out of them. As when you employ them, the enemy cannot really really shoot them as mosquitoes. They're always going to come back. But are they decisive? No. By definition, they're not decisive. Right. By the way, there were, together with horse archers, also among the Iranian nomads, especially the ones, in fact, living closer to the Middle East, and in fact the same Parni, the same Dahai, lots of javeliners on horseback. For the same reasons we said before. It's not that a world apparently dominated by horse archery renders javelins useless at all, right? So actually, especially the early Parthian armies would have witnessed a lot of that, and that surely does not disappear later, right? But if you had watched those early Partni, for example, it would have looked straightforwardly European, like they're not like that heavily sort of Middle Eastern sort of kind of brown Persified sense that we have of the. I mean, if there was an actual Aryan, literally as the tribe that was called like that at the time, in the Persian wars in Greece, this definitely existed from the Achaemenid side rather than the Hellenic one. Of course, like at large, the Greeks were wider for the same reasons that the Achaemenids did rule over these other peoples that were not, in fact, Iranians, like their dynasty maybe was. By the way, we don't have the full certainty even there, but there's no doubt we've seen it with the Manayans, with looking back at the Bronze Age, how early this Iranian pastoral nomads had began to permeate the whole world, and so how mostly all the various dynasties were Indo-European. hell, it seems like the Sumerians were Indo-Europeans, the Assyrians were Indo-European, at least in originally. Then, of course, yes, the Semitic element was there. There was, but they had begun as the subjects, you see. And this is a bit the same in proportion. There is no doubt that horse archers, as we said before, are also pretty nasty, right? Especially from a psychological point of view. It's not much the actual missile that physically arming causes the main deal. It's the psychological impact of a relentless hail of arrows that especially is meant just to be a prelude to a broader attack. In all those dusty Levantine semi-arid landscapes, like you wouldn't know in the thirst, in the adrenaline, in the sweat, in the blood, like when the cataphracts would finally show up, and when like this was when yet another wave of horse archers would come. Maybe those cataphracts were kilometers away. This was a problem that the Westerners always met. We've seen it with the Byzantines at Manzikert. Imagine walking for kilometers and kilometers during the day under archery fire, seeing clouds of dust, not realizing where the bulk of the enemy is, and waiting and being worn out, right? Psychophysically in a shocking way, right? Cavalry is instead mostly an issue of poor leadership, bad decisions, right? That's a massacre, but it's also not actually one of the, at least from the general honor and issues of Roman politics, such a huge. It's one of those battles that, again, single peoples can say, okay, we scored this against the Romans. Well, yeah, because that's normally what happens. But it's definitely not a proof of any sort of broader tactical superiority of the Parthians as a military system against the Romans. Now, what to say? You understood that today we didn't even talk so much about the actual organic of these units, because we could even do it attentively, but I mean, to an extent, who cares, right? They would have organized themselves in a decimal system on some other basis, depending on which kind of troops we're talking about. Normally the nomads had a decimal basis or organization. It's not a surprise for anyone. The most important aspect here is understanding also how these forces would agglutinate or would simply also disband on the simple basis of their political and social background, and then bringing all these forces together, harassing the enemy, and then sort of going all together in to the fray was the general, not just tactic but also strategy at the point. And everything would be very difficult to simply control by a single leader. Everything was based on his charisma, on his general prowess and current political support, etc. But of course, everything is also relative to the situation, and there is really a lot in this people's histories that shows you how divided, chronically divided it could be. And that's, at the end of the day, like the point. Had they been more politically compact, they would have been also more military proficient. Right, that's the difference with Rome. It's not a technique or another. It's actually moral forces, as always. Right, and this is yet probably another thing. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.